Before we ask about the great event on Paul Robeson's 125th birth anniversary, which just passed last week, for those that don't know, could you talk a bit about who Robeson was? For me, the fact that such a stupendous human being is not more celebrated in our country depicts an archetypical example of what Winston called capitalism's twin evils of racism and anti communism. So, can you tell us a bit about his life, about his work, and why you think, after having been one of the most famous individuals in the world, today the ruling class ignores or whitewashes him?
Well, Carlos, you're right. Robeson was a spectacular human being, uh, a rare human being. There are not many like him in the history of humanity, certainly the history of modernity. Uh, his accomplishments are generally known by people who know who Robeson was. He was an athlete, um, played four different sports at Rutgers University. He was an All American, I think, in most of them. Um, but he was also a brilliant student. Um, upon graduation from Rutgers, he went to law school. He got a law degree. But Robeson ultimately moved uh, from the law to art. And, he matures or comes into maturity, into adulthood in the period known as the Harlem Renaissance, that is, the 1920s, uh, focused essentially in Harlem, New York, but this was a great artistic, uh, literary, and intellectual movement of African Americans. Among them, of course, was Robeson and Langston Hughes, the great poet, uh, Duke Ellington and Fletcher Henderson, the great composers and band leaders, Louis Armstrong, of course, the virtuoso musician, uh, and artists, painters would emerge from that spirit, such as Romare Bearden, Jacob Lawrence, and others. Um, Augusta Strong, I should mention, Zora Neale Hurston, and others. It was this great period. Um Robeson uh, was tapped for the theater first, and in a Eugene O'Neill play, and it was an off-Broadway success. Um, he would go on to continue uh, in theatric work. The high point of that, of course, in the early 1940s, when he played the role of Othello in Shakespeare's famous play Othello. Um, but it was discovered that he had an extraordinary voice. Um, one of the most extraordinary voices of his time. His range is known as Basso profundo, uh, and it is really a popular voice in Russia, and at that time the Soviet Union, which in some ways accounts for his popularity in Russia, besides the fact that he spoke Russian like a Russian. Uh, but he then went on to study in London uh, at the London School of Economics, a School of Oriental Studies. And he focused upon Africa and Asia, but specifically Africa. And and during his time there in the mid 1930s, he declared himself an African. He said, I want to be an African. I want to discover my cultural, linguistic, and civilizational roots. He said, I'm an American, but I'm an African American. Uh, but the 30s was a very turbulent time. It was the period of the global collapse of the capitalist world economy. Uh, and the upsurge of class conflict, the organization in the United States of unorganized workers, of unemployed workers. This struggle combined with the struggle against racial oppression manifested in the fight for the freedom of the Scottsboro Nine, and so on. But this was all around the world. But then there was a countervailing force arising in Germany under the leadership of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, which was committed to subduing the working class in Germany and ultimately taking down Bolshevism and socialism in the Soviet Union. In this respect, Hitler was not much different than many Western politicians who also wanted to undo the working class in this militant struggle, something that had not been seen in the West since the 1840s, 1848 in particular, with the wave of strikes and so on. This was another iteration of that. So Western politicians wanted, capitalist politicians that is, wanted to take the working class down, and their long-term strategic objective was to undo the Russian Revolution and to bring down Bolshevism as they saw it. So Robeson returns to the United States and throws himself into the democratic and anti-fascist movements. When World War II breaks out, well, before World War II broke out, he joined with the Spanish Republic in fighting against the fascists who were trying to overthrow it. He went to Spain. He sang on the front line for the forces fighting against Franco and the fascists. He, at home, encouraged young men and women to join the fight in Spain, and so on. But then when World War II breaks out, he sees this war as an existential threat to democracy and to socialism. And a lot of people get it wrong. They think or thought that Paul Robeson should just be concerned with defeating Hitler and not the defense of socialism in the Soviet Union. He literally said during the period of McCarthyism, let me reintroduce myself. I am the son of a slave. My people laid the initial, through their free labor, produced the initial wealth upon which this nation is built. And don't tell me to go back to Russia. This is my country and I'm going to fight for it, by which he meant the fight for democracy and ultimately for socialism. But the thing that is seldom mentioned when people talk about Paul Robeson is his mastery of languages, his move in art and singing towards folk culture, towards the folk music of various civilizations and cultures. And he declared that he would not sing the works of classical music, but that he would devote his concerts completely to singing folk music. And he learned all kinds of languages. Some estimate upwards of 25. Emma Goldman, the Russian anarchist, said that he spoke Russian like a Russian. And he learned Chinese and sang the Chinese national anthem, which was the song that inspired the Long March entitled March of the Volunteers. And he sang that wonderfully and beautifully and inspiringly in Chinese. But the thing that is so interesting and impressive to me is how he used his knowledge of folk culture and folk music and working class struggles, along with his study of languages, to put forward a hypothesis concerning the oneness of humanity and the oneness of human civilization. And I think one of the most extraordinary observations that he made was that there was a linguistic link between the Bantu languages of Central Africa, in particular the Congo, and the Slavic languages of Central Europe. He said it was his familiarity and knowledge of Bantu languages which made his mastery of the Russian language quite easy, even easier than learning, for example, French or German. And he suggested that this was because there was a civilizational link between Central Africa and Central Europe. Now, that was not just an idle or passive academic observation on his part, because for him, that insight suggested that the differences which are assumed based on nation and race and language and culture are not as deep and not as profound as normally thought. That the most important thing that he observed about human beings and their cultures is that they are more alike than they are different. And to discover that, you have to go back to their ancient folk cultures, ancient narratives, ancient mythologies. And you have to know their languages, at least in their primary form, in their more ancient form. And once you do that, you see, as he would say, that all men are brothers, that we are linked in very profound ways. And hence, even though global exploitation and war had brought diverse people into contact with one another, what it showed to them is that we are more alike than we are different. And that is ironic, because the capitalist class and the oppressors and war makers always tell the oppressed that you are more different than you are alike. And Robeson countered that. So I would say, if I were to speak of the major careers in his life, there is the artistic, which is the singing, the acting, and to a certain extent, the sportsman. Secondly, there is the huge political part of his life, where he committed himself to do everything possible to end war and fascism and to usher in a period of global democracy and socialism. And the third is Paul Robeson as a scientist of culture and language, and his proposals concerning human civilizations and cultures, and how much they are alike, and how the differences are not as deep as the similarities.